Another complementarity problem relates to the problem of role strain. Now, role strain is a bit different than role conflict, as it relates to just one status instead of two statuses. It's the incompatibility between two or major role demands or role expectations within a single status. Got that? Within a single status. Not two or more statuses clashing as it is in role conflict, but rather within a given status. So, for example, college professors, the role of college professor. We're supposed to teach, we're supposed to be effective in the classroom, we're supposed to be fair, and so forth. But we're also supposed to research. In fact, this probably bears more weight on ultimately getting tenure than does our teaching effectiveness. We're supposed to publish. We're supposed to publish books and articles in scholarly journals. Very important as well. And also we're supposed to provide some kind of service to the university, to the broader community or the profession. We're supposed to do things beyond the teaching and research components of our role as well. Now, every professor comes up, every new professor ultimately comes up for tenure around the 6th or 7th year that they've been at a given institution. And typically the major criteria are effective teaching and research, and particularly research. But nonetheless, teaching and research are the two biggies, if you will. Now, can you see a strain between the two, particularly if you're a professor that right after graduate school you get your PhD and you get a job and you're trying to prepare your courses and you're trying to become an effective professor, but also you've got to devise a research agenda and you've got to be out there generating perhaps research grants and conducting research studies and writing them up and publishing them. Both teaching and research are extremely time-consuming and thus often produce role strain for professors. Again, the problem is within a given status and competing or strained role components. The third is internalization. To what extent do you internalize the role? How important is that role to you? So that is a critical factor. Is the role not at all important? Then, in fact, you don't even see yourself as owning that role. So, for example, you're a cool kid, but you've got to work at a fast food restaurant because that's the only employment around, and you need the money, you need income to be able to meet certain things. Car payments, car insurance, perhaps. Perhaps you're living away from home while attending school, you've got to pay rent and so forth. But the point is, you're much too cool for that job. And so you're likely not to define that job as all that important. In fact, you may come to work schlepping your uniform inside a brown paper bag and go in after you go into the restroom and change, and after you've changed, you come out and you see the manager and hope upon hope that that manager will assign you away from the counter because you don't want your peers to see you, your customer peers to see you behind that counter dressed in that kind of funny looking uniform. You don't want to be identified with that job. So you're practicing role distance. Now, since it's distant to you, do you think that job's going to be, do you think you're going to be really all that concerned about that job and fulfilling it correctly? Well, you may be to the extent that you're able to keep the job. But If you screw up in the job, so what? It's not really you, right? So role distance does not generally promote good role performance. Another possibility, and this is a real positive possibility, is that you embrace the role. The role is an important part of you. You take it seriously and you want to do well in that role. You've adopted it. It's a significant part of you. A parent typically will adopt the role of parent, mom or dad, and it becomes a significant part of them. You invest yourself in the role. Your identity, a major part of your identity, is that role you're playing as mom or dad. And what ensures that you're going to be an effective parent is not others standing around watching you, as might be the case in a fast food service job, but rather you've internalized it to the extent that if you don't play it effectively, you feel bad. You feel guilt. So there's that internal sanction, that internal sense of guilt that promotes effective job performance. Okay? So role embracement is extremely important for doing the job well. I suspect that almost all of you embrace the role of student. You're not distant from it. You've embraced the role of student. You want to do well. And if you don't do well, you feel bad. You feel guilt. Another possibility, however, is role merger. And in this case, you're not able to effectively compartmentalize the role. It really kind of carries over, in fact, into other roles that you're playing so much that it interferes with your ability to play other roles. Unable to compartmentalize role, and unable to kind of leave it, for the time being, and embrace or play the role of your next status that you're moving into. So, for example, you're a drill sergeant, and you're a husband as well. Now, I know this to be the case because over the years I've had a number of drill sergeants enroll in my classes at UTSA, and almost invariably, once I've gotten to know them, they confide to me that their marriages are in trouble or have been in trouble. They're divorced or they're currently in trouble. And almost invariably, one of the main problems that they're having is that they're unable to drop the role of drill sergeant when they come home to their families. So they tend to treat their wives and their children as if the wives and children are basic trainees rather than, family members. They might bark at them, bark orders at them, administer rather stark and harsh punishments if they fail to comply. And so they've got a problem in compartmentalizing. The role has merged, the role of drill sergeant has merged into other roles that they're playing. Another possibility, and I think this is where the Zimbardo interview comes in real well, is role engulfment. They're not just unable to separate their roles neatly, but they're overwhelmed by them. The role becomes all-consuming, and almost, indeed, probably their identities become submerged in the role. They're overwhelmed. And they may, in fact, act in ways that are contradictory to who they believe they are. So at Abu Ghraib, the prison in military prison in Iraq, and in Zimbardo's study of imprisonment on the campus of Stanford, Zimbardo found that the guards became overwhelmed by that role and began behaving in a very sadistic and cruel way, and that the prisoners tended to revert to typical prisoner-like behavior. So in both cases, they were engulfed, they were overwhelmed. So I do definitely want you to watch the videos on Abu Ghraib and the Zimbardo experiment. The Zimbardo experiment is a classic in sociology. Internalization then. Role distance, role embracement, role merger, and role engulfment. As you can see, all but role embracement have problems for effective role performance. Fourth, to what extent do others playing their role support you? To what extent is there mutual support? Do they, in short, play out their role as they're supposed to? Important question. If they don't, it makes it hard for you to play out your role effectively. So if they cooperate and play out their role effectively, as we see on the left side, that typically guarantees or helps guarantee role success. But if they're oppositional, wow, professor with an oppositional student, or wife with an oppositional husband, really problematic in playing out roles. Or they're non-supportive even. They may not be actively standing in your way, but they're non-supportive. So students in a class, in a face-to-face class, they're not causing trouble for the instructor, but they're not engaging themselves in the class either. They're not engaging perhaps in class discussion. Although they're not disrupting class, they're not engaging. So that tends to, diminish your ability to be a good instructor in the classroom. Consider examples. How can you be an effective wife if your husband is out regularly cheating, or even occasionally cheating for that matter? How can you be an effective spouse or wife when that's the case? When they're not performing let's say she's a stay-at-home mom, and the husband is supposed to, of course, play the role of wage earner, yet the husband's not performing that role. Can't hold a job, can't get out of bed to go to work. Very difficult for you then, as wife, to be effective in your role as well. Again, how many times do students not play their role, or professors not play their role for that matter? How many times have you had courses, I hope not too many, but sometimes courses where the professor's not really all into it? He or she perhaps doesn't attend class on a regular basis. Does that indeed then make you interested in going to class? Or if there's no effective presentation, there's no lectures given that are on point, or if you're not tested about the materials, that then diminishes your role, the effective performance of your role as student, quite clearly. Clarity is the final role performance issue. How clear is your role to you and to others? Is it spelled out so that you'll know what to do and how to do it? I can see in the case of online teaching, I perhaps haven't spelled out very clearly what the role of assignments are in this class. And so I've had a lot of students write emails about what do I do with all these readings and videos do you want me to answer questions? And I've replied, no, just study these. Take good notes on them. Use them to prepare for the exams. So how well is that role spelled out to you? Another way of looking at it is in terms of a fancy term called institutionalization. How deeply is it embedded in the culture so that you learn what the role is? You may not have ever played it, but you learn what's involved in the role because you've been exposed to it. You've seen others performing it. It's not novel. It's perhaps based on tradition. In short, a role is more effectively played if there's a minimal degree of ambiguity or confusion about it. So let me give you an example here. Let's compare two roles. In many ways, they involve much the same thing, but in some ways they don't. Okay, so on the one hand, you have a person, or you have a relationship between mates, live-in lovers. They're live-in lovers. They live together. They are around each other, a lot. They have sexual relations with one another, and so forth. On the other end of the continuum, you have a married couple, husband, wife, or partnered in some way. Could be perhaps a gay relationship or a lesbian relationship, but at any rate, they're spouses. Okay, so which of the two is minimally ambiguous? Which is more clear to people? What if you have questions about hanging in there and continuing the relationship? Obviously, if you're husband and wife or married partners, you're going to hang in there, right? If something comes up, some problem, or perhaps the partner comes up with a disease, and you'll be there to nurture that partner, right? On the other hand, if you're live-in lovers, how far do you go? After all, there's nothing constraining you, really, nothing legally necessarily constraining you from leaving and moving on. What about income and earnings? If you're a live-in lover, do you have your own account? Most married couples, I would submit, don't have their own accounts, their own piles of money. Usually they join them together. Often live-in lovers won't. So institutionalization is important. Obviously, for spouses, we have a rich tradition of understanding the responsibilities. Live-in lovers, not so much. In fact, do we really have a good set of terms describing that relationship as opposed to husband, wife, spouse? What do we call that person who comes home with us, let's say at Christmas time, to meet our parents for the first time? I'd like you to meet my live-in lover, mom, dad, or I'd like you to meet my partner, mom or dad. It's kind of delicate, right? We don't really even have a good term yet for I'd like you to meet the person I'm shacking up with. It just isn't there yet in our culture. Partner kind of has a ring that doesn't genuinely capture the idea, right? Differing role expectations is what we find typically in the case of roles that are not clearly defined. Differing role expectations. Each, if they're in an ambiguous setting like live-in lovers, they may well bring in very different ideas about how they're supposed to behave. Finally, let's just touch on role exit. The process of becoming an X. We go through this almost invariably. We will exit our roles, right? And sometimes it's incredibly difficult and hard. to do, the process of becoming an X, even if we maybe look forward to it. I'm getting up there in age, and I could have retired a long time ago, but I have certain qualms about going into retirement, leaving my academic life behind. So role X, the process of becoming an X, matters greatly on one hand if it's a voluntary exit or an involuntary exit, right? If I retire, when and if I retire, it'll be my choice. Thank goodness. We don't have to retire at 65 like airline pilots do. That makes it easier if it's voluntary. If, on the other hand, I receive notice from the administration that, Miller, it's about time you retire because you're no longer effective in the classroom, you're no longer doing research, and we can't necessarily make up your mind for you, but we suggest that you retire. That would almost be involuntary, right? But how about if I didn't have tenure and I was removed from the job, I was fired? Or how about a spouse who is informed by the other spouse that they no longer want to be married? Moreover, here's the divorce papers. Now we're talking about involuntary role exit. And certainly that can be devastating. So becoming disengaged from a role can have important effects, profound effects on one's being. Disengagement from a role certainly requires tremendous adjustment if that role has been a long-standing, important one in your life. Many of you, most of you probably will become parents, and at some point your children will begin their own lives, their own independent lives apart from you. Right now we're empty nesters, my wife and I. Our kids are in their 30s. In fact, that happened to us quite some time ago, that we became empty nesters. But it's required adjustment on our parts, tremendous adjustment, because we enjoyed being active in their lives, and no longer are they around on a daily basis. They're far removed from us. One's in California, the other's in Utah. So it's been difficult to change our parenting style. Certainly if you're terminated from a job, it can be incredibly difficult, the adjustment, particularly if you can't find employment right away. Even retiring voluntarily, you can see the problem, right? That I might have if I really enjoyed that job and suddenly it's no longer there, even though it's been my choice. So divorce typically is difficult, if not devastating, for partners. Job loss, likewise. Yet we have to cope. We have to deal with role exit. Okay, with this, I want to stop my lecturing on status and role. Remember the importance of these concepts, particularly for defining stability and predictability in human behavior.